Are the 2019-23 Springboks the greatest rugby team ever? You would have seen the comparisons, you'd have seen the discussions. It's now time to talk about it in the video. So welcome back to the channel, and you can let me know what you think in the comments section. You can like the video as well if you feel obliged, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel as well. I always massively appreciate that. But to get straight into it, this is a conversation that was always going to happen if the Springboks went back-to-back. They become only the second team ever to do that. The other team to have done that, New Zealand 2011 to 2015, who up until this point, and maybe still, are widely regarded as the greatest rugby team to have ever played the game. So naturally, these comparisons are going to be made, and frankly, it's a bit of fun to talk about it. It doesn't really matter. And also, it's completely subjective. There's no right answer here, but I think it is quite interesting to compare eras and to compare teams. But exactly because of that, because they were different eras, it's impossible to get to a definite opinion on this. But even so, you let me know your views on it down below. And it is realistically, actually, because these teams have gone back to back. Are there any other teams that you would throw in the mix for this conversation? Previously, you couldn't argue against the All Blacks. They were the only team to have ever won World Cups one after the other. Now South Africa have done this. Are there any other sides that you would throw in, though, just to give them their respect, that aren't involved in this conversation because they haven't done it over that sort of period of time, but maybe are still worth it? You can let me know. But let's get into it then. I'm going to start with the All Blacks of 2011-2015, move on to the Boks, and then get to kind of where my conclusions are on this. In terms of New Zealand, I mean, that All Blacks team were quite literally not just the most dominant team in rugby, they were the most dominant team in all of sports. Their win percentage was ridiculously high. They didn't lose back-to-back test matches. They dominated the rugby landscape for that era that they were playing in. I think they had some teams beat before they even stepped out on the field. It was almost the height of the All Black aura, which we have seen kind of fade away and be chipped away at a little bit over the last few years when they've started to lose more games. But you look back then, you knew that the All Blacks barely ever lost, and they certainly didn't lose games back to back. And that's reflected in their win percentage and in what they won, not just the World Cups, but they dominated the Rugby Championship as well. Pretty much every year they would win the Rugby Championship. And when we get on to talking about the Springboks, we can maybe talk about it more. But that is an area that South Africa haven't had that same level of dominance that New Zealand have had. I know the Springbok fans might point towards the schedule and things maybe not being to their advantage compared with New Zealand and Australia, for example. But it's still worth noting when talking about this New Zealand team, they have dominated the Rugby Championship. They did dominate the Rugby Championship over those years. And then linked to that dominance, I think that New Zealand team were tactically and skill-wise just ahead of everyone else. They were completely ahead of the trend, I think, in terms of every other international team. They set the trends. Everyone else had to try and keep up with them, which maybe now they have done. And then if you look at some of the other hurdles that they maybe had to come over, that 2011 World Cup, New Zealand hadn't won a World Cup since 1987, the original World Cup. They were labelled as bottlers. They never turned up when it mattered, losing in 2003, in 2007, through the 90s, then having a World Cup at home, the pressure of having to deal with that, and it was a huge pressure having to come through that final. They also then did it without Dan Carter as well. So that psychological battle that All Blacks team had to come through, I think, is worth noting. And then if we want to talk about the actual names within that team, Richie McCaw will come up as arguably the greatest player ever, certainly in terms of the forwards. Dan Carter as probably the greatest fly half ever, leading the back line. Then look at the centres. Ma Nonu, his replacement off the bench, Sonny Bill Williams, Conrad Smith. We could go through that whole team and there are legendary names across it. So we all understand why that New Zealand team, they played brilliant rugby, they dominated, and they won things, and they had incredible players, of why they're in this conversation as possibly the greatest rugby team ever. But let's get on to the Springboks, 2019 to 2023. Well, first up, is this the hardest World Cup ever? They had the hardest route to the final. I think that's undeniable in terms of Scotland and Ireland in their pool. The 1-point wins in quarterfinal, semi-final, final against some top opposition, having to beat all of the best teams in the world. But also the rugby landscape is harder now. And this isn't sour grapes, this isn't a slight on that New Zealand team. Conrad Smith himself in an interview spoke about it prior to the World Cup. It's harder now to win international rugby because everyone else has caught up. Now that's not the fault of New Zealand in 2011 and 2015. As I say, or as I've just said, they were ahead of everyone tactically and from a skill point of view, and they deserve huge credit for that. But I think the Springboks have probably had to deal with a more competitive landscape to be able to win certainly this title. 2019, I don't know where that fits into it, maybe a bit more of a grey area. I think teams were catching up. So I think it's been more difficult in a sense in terms of purely the World Cup for this New Zealand team. Having said that, they haven't won on as consistent a basis as the All Blacks. I think they approached some of these World Cup cycles in a different way. Certainly the last 4 years in building depth and rotating their team. And also they lost a big chunk of time to COVID. You know, they lost probably the best part of a year to COVID and were still able to go back to back. They won a Lions series in the middle of that as well, which the New Zealand team didn't have to do. And then we get onto the coaching duo. And I think Rassie Erasmus and Jacques Nienaber are arguably the best coaches of all time, certainly the best coaching duo that we've seen. When you look at their tactical innovation, talking about the bench split, talking about not calling up specialist positions, a team that is able to deal with not having specialist positions. And I know I mentioned it already that the All Blacks team in 2011 were able to deal with not having Dan Carter. But I think this Springboks team are able to, they're able to deal with a World Cup final where they play most of it without a specialist hooker, not having a specialist scrum half as a replacement on the bench. They have done things different tactically to evolve the game. You look at a lot of teams now play with a 6-2 bench split, which is something we saw the Springboks do at the 2019 World Cup. And then also we have the development of the game plan of this current South African team. They started off playing quite one-dimensionally. I know Springbok fans don't like it getting brought up in terms of now because I don't think it's fair for this World Cup. But 2019, they played a certain way because Erasmus came in, they didn't have much time with the players and they played a certain way to win games. But they have then developed that game plan to get themselves to 2023. And maybe they did, or they probably had to use a certain tactical game to win that final because of the conditions. But even so, it is a much more all-round Springbok team than we saw. So the development of that team, I think, between the years is quite fascinating. So those are my points for both teams, why they deserve to be in this conversation as the greatest teams of all time. What are my conclusions? Well, I don't think we've ever seen or will ever see again a side play with the style of that New Zealand team and the aura of that New Zealand team. You felt some teams were beaten before they stepped on the field and they ran up scores. They had such skill across the team. They were revolutionary, really, in terms of the skill set they demanded of their team. And I think they're a massive reason why we look at where the game is now and we want forwards that are able to catch and pass and dummy and offload. I think a lot of that came because of the skill set of that New Zealand team. But having said that, I don't think we've ever seen a team with the kind of dogged fight, belief, ability to stay in games in the way that this Springbok team has proven that they're able to do. And actually, I saw someone on Twitter, I'm not going to pass this off as my own thought, but I thought was quite a good way of describing it, of that 2011-2015 All Blacks team was almost like Pep Guardiola's Barcelona. Just changed the game, retained possession, were this well-oiled, skillful machine that won everything there was to be won. And almost this Springbok team is a bit more like the kind of Zidane-Ancelotti era at Real Madrid, in that they just keep churning out wins. It almost doesn't matter what comes in front of them, they will find a way to win, which I thought was quite a good analogy. So it wasn't my own, but I thought it was worth mentioning in the video. Where do I come down on this? As I said at the top of the video, it's a bit of fun. There is no right answer. I'm edging towards the All Blacks, I think purely because of their dominance in between World Cups. And I know that the Springboks didn't necessarily try and dominate in between World Cups. They tried to build depth. But I think if we're talking about this, they've both won 2 World Cups. And actually, I think they both have had similar World Cup wins, but in reverse order. 2011, New Zealand had their arm wrestle, trying just about to get themselves over the line to win it. And then they relatively breezed to the title in 2015, as much as anyone can breeze to a title, but they won that final quite comfortably. Whereas the Springboks, I think, have done it the other way round. They had their arm wrestle just on the weekend in the Stade de France, and they beat England quite comfortably in the final in 2019. But I'm edging towards the All Blacks, two unbelievably brilliant teams. I think because of the All Blacks' dominance across the whole cycle, and I think also because they set the blueprint for where professional international rugby is now, that's probably why I would go for them. I can imagine there'll be a lot of you going for the Boks in the comments, but you can let me know, what do you make of it? Who is the greatest team of all time? New Zealand 2011-2015, South Africa 2019-2023, or, as I said at the top of the video, would you throw any other teams in there that are worthy of consideration? I don't know, I think there's a few that you could do. I'm not going to go there, but I think there is a few. I'm interested to see what you say. Guys, remember to hit a thumbs up on the video. It just gives it that little boost. And also, subscribe to the channel as well. Really, really appreciate it, those of you that are already subscribed and those of you that are willing to hit that subscribe button. Enjoy the conversation, enjoy the video. I'll see you in the next one.